Surveying the records of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, of the state ratifying conventions that followed, and the political and philosophical tracts produced by Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike, one is struck repeatedly by the debaters' invocation of history, particularly that of ancient Rome and post-Elizabethan Britain. With seeming ease and obvious confidence that their audiences would understand them, they referred to past episodes and personages, thereby exhibiting a form of knowledge derived in the last analysis from books. This impression is reinforced by perusal of the political pamphlet literature that flourished in astonishing profusion in America between 1763 and the 1790s. Pamphlets often replete with Latin quotations, as well as references to ancient and modern authors. Our impression grows even stronger when we sample the correspondence of the Founding Fathers, most notably the incomparable letters exchanged between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in their old age. "Reading is my delight," wrote Jefferson to Adams late in life. In letter after scintillating letter, the two men exchanged views on books that they had been reading. The Founding Fathers' acquaintance with the written word was not confined to works in the English language. For many of them, Latin and Greek were virtually second tongues. Jefferson was fluent in French and Spanish as well, and he was not the only one with such linguistic ability. Benjamin Franklin was another. All in all, late 18th century America was demonstrably a literate civilization. Its literacy rate, in fact, was probably the highest in the world. And at its apex was a singular array of individuals who were men of learning as well as men of power. What did these busy lawyers, merchants, agribusinessmen, and politicians actually read? From their surviving correspondence and other writings, a clear composite picture quickly emerges. First, the men of the revolutionary generation were for the most part steeped in what are known as the classics. Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, Tacitus, and Cicero. From these and other famous men of letters, the framers of the Constitution obtained their knowledge of ancient history. History, in fact, was of consuming interest to the founders. It was not just something they had to study in school. Nor was its subject matter confined to far-off Greece and Rome. The history of modern Great Britain, and particularly its generations-long internal struggles for liberty, had, for the catalysts of our independence, an endless appeal. Not surprisingly, many of them were strongly attracted to the so-called Whig theory of history, propounded by, among others, the British writer and political activist Catherine Macaulay, whose 8-volume History of England, published between 1763 and 1783, achieved great popularity on this side of the Atlantic. When Mrs. Macaulay, who sympathized with the American cause, visited the United States in 1785, she was entertained by George Washington himself at Mount Vernon. Ranking with history as a focus of the founders' reading interests was what we would today call political philosophy. Their favorite sources were extraordinarily varied, from Aristotle among the ancients to their Scottish contemporary David Hume, the judicious Hume, Alexander Hamilton once labeled him, although I can tell you that Jefferson and Adams didn't have quite the same high opinion of Hume. Particularly prominent on the founders' bookshelves was the outpouring of 18th century libertarian literature exemplified by Bolingbroke, James Berg, and a volume called Cato's Letters, authored by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. Another exceedingly popular political theorist was John Locke, whose 2 treatises of government achieved almost iconic status. Jefferson ranked John Locke with Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton as the three greatest men who had ever lived. He called them my Trinity. Also significant was the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly in the emerging field of political economy pioneered by Adam Smith, whose book, The Wealth of Nations, was published, interestingly enough, in 1776. From France came Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, probably the most cited text among all the texts cited in the debates and writings of the founders. And a generation later from France came the writings of the so-called physiocrats. From Switzerland came the natural law teachings of Burlamaqui and Vattel. Now, this is not the place to try to appraise the relative impact of the streams of thought represented by these towering and often very diverse figures. My point, rather, is that the leading political figures of late 18th century America were generally and often intimately acquainted with the output of the greatest European minds of their day and of the minds of the ancient Western world. I repeat, the Founding Fathers, with few exceptions, were readers. Not surprisingly, since many of them by profession were lawyers, and in fact more than half of those at the Constitutional Convention were lawyers, Sir William Blackstone's massive Commentaries on the Laws of England, published in the 1760s, became a fixture of their personal libraries and a resource that they repeatedly cited in public debate. And although history, political philosophy, and law dominated their serious reading, as we would expect, these practical-minded statesmen were by no means unfamiliar with literature, or as it was often then called, belles lettres. John Adams, for instance, owned complete sets of Homer, Plato, Horace, and Marcus Aurelius, to mention a few of the classical authors most popular in his generation. The Bible and Shakespeare also formed part of the literary patrimony of the founders. Even contemporary English poetry and fiction did not escape their attention. In his later years, Adams, for one, frankly enjoyed what he called romances. In this, however, I have to report, the founders of our country were not unanimous. The somewhat didactic Jefferson told a friend in 1818 that the novels of his day were a mass of trash. Poison that infects the mind and becomes a great obstacle to good education. Fiction, he argued, should have moral utility. Nothing of mere amusement, he declared, should lumber a public library. I wonder how many of our public libraries today could survive on that standard. Two factors, above all, placed an ineffaceable stamp on the reading habits of the American revolutionaries. The first was the prevailing mode of their education: rigorous, classical, and thoroughly book-oriented. As early as the ages of 8 or 9, either in schools or in the custody of private tutors, colonial boys entered into concentrated study of Greek and Latin. This was no casual affectation. Demonstrated proficiency in these languages was a prerequisite to entrance into college, and more than half of the 55 men who convened in Philadelphia in 1787 had attended college. Upon entering college, which American males in those days customarily did in their early to mid-teens, they could expect to encounter most of the authors whom I have previously mentioned. Consider, for example, the higher education of William Patterson, who later represented New Jersey at the Constitutional Convention. After passing entrance examinations in Latin and Greek, he enrolled in the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, in 1759 at the age of 14.